October 1941. The forests outside Vyazma. Snow had come early that year, and it sat thin and uncertain on the broken pine boughs, melting and freezing again with every shift of wind. Nadia Kuznetsova was 22 years old, a medical student from Smolensk who had finished her training in 8 weeks instead of 3 years, because the war demanded it. The red cross on her sleeve had been sewn by her mother, the stitches uneven, the cloth a little too pale. Her boots were 2 sizes too large. Inside the left one, folded against the lining, was a photograph of her brother in his Red Army uniform, taken the summer before the war began. He was smiling in it. He was not smiling now. He was somewhere south of Kiev, and she had not heard from him in 3 months. She moved between the wounded in a clearing that smelled of blood and burnt cloth. The German Ninth Army had broken through the line 3 days earlier. Whole Soviet divisions had ceased to exist. Now what remained of her unit, medics, walking wounded, a handful of men with bolt-action rifles and 4 bullets between them, was waiting for orders that would not come. When the first German motorcycle appeared on the forest road, Nadia did not run. She knelt beside a soldier whose abdomen she had been trying to close for the past hour, and she kept her hands where they were. She had been told what Soviet medics were supposed to do if capture was certain. She had been told what happened to women in particular if they were taken. The pistol inside her field jacket was meant for that purpose. It had been issued to her by her commanding officer with a single sentence of instruction, spoken without looking at her face. She did not reach for it. Later, much later, when she was an old woman in a small apartment in Smolensk, she would say she could not remember why. She would say only that the soldier under her hands had been alive when the motorcycle came, and that to let go of him in order to die seemed, in that moment, a kind of betrayal worse than any she had been warned about. What she could not have known, kneeling in that clearing with her hands red to the wrists, was that the German High Command had already issued a specific written order regarding women like her. It was not a battlefield improvisation. It was not the anger of a single officer. It had been typed onto official letterhead, stamped, signed, and circulated through ordinary administrative channels to commanders across the entire Eastern Front. And what it said about her, about every woman who wore the uniform of the Red Army, was that the laws of war did not apply. If you want to understand the part of the Second World War that almost no one talks about, the part that was buried for half a century inside Soviet silence and German shame, stay with me to the end. Subscribe, like the video, and do not leave before the final section, because what was revealed when the archives finally opened in the 1990s is something you will not be able to forget, and what one 91-year-old woman said at a museum in Minsk in the spring of 2003 is, perhaps, the closest any survivor ever came to telling the whole truth. To understand what happened to Nadia Kuznetsova, and to the roughly 800,000 other Soviet women who served their country in uniform during the Second World War, you have to understand 2 things that history textbooks usually leave out. The first is who they were. By the autumn of 1942, the Red Army was the only major fighting force in the world in which women served in nearly every combat role. They were not nurses behind the lines. They were frontline medics who crawled into no man's land under fire to drag wounded men back to dressing stations. They were snipers, some of them counted by the end of the war, among the deadliest marksmen in the entire conflict. They were tank drivers and mechanics. They were pilots, including the celebrated 588th Night Bomber Regiment, the women the Germans called the Nachthexen, the night witches, because they flew their canvas and wood biplanes at night with their engines cut so that the only sound from the sky was the soft hiss of wind through wires before the bomb fell. They were radio operators parachuted behind enemy lines to coordinate with partisans. They were anti-aircraft gunners. They were political officers. They were scouts and military police and telegraphists and combat engineers. The numbers are difficult to comprehend even now. Roughly 200,000 Soviet women served as anti-aircraft gunners, roughly 150,000 as combat medics, tens of thousands as signalers and telegraphists, several thousand as snipers, trained at the Central Women's School of Sniper Training outside Moscow, where the curriculum was 12 weeks of marksmanship, camouflage, fieldcraft, and a kind of patience that was older than the war itself. There were 3 full air regiments composed entirely of women, the most famous being the 588th, but also a fighter regiment and a heavy bomber regiment. There were female tank commanders, including at least one who would later receive the highest decoration the Soviet state could give. There were partisan units in the forests of Belarus and Ukraine, in which the majority of the fighters were women, because the men of the village had already been taken east or killed, or were hiding in the woods themselves. There were nurses on the very front lines who, by official Red Army regulation, were required to drag wounded men back to safety along with their personal weapons, because a rifle abandoned to the enemy was a punishable offense, even in a battlefield evacuation. Most were very young. Maria Belova, a radio operator from a village outside Minsk, was 18 when she enlisted in the autumn of 1941. Vera Sokolova, a sniper trainee who would later be sent to Stalingrad, was 19. Yelena Petrova, a former teacher from Kharkov, was 24, which made her one of the older women in her unit. Many lied about their age to be allowed in at all. They came from collective farms and factory towns. They came from Moscow apartments where the bookshelves were full and Ukrainian villages where the wells were still dug by hand. They came from places where, the year before, they had been milking cows or sitting school examinations or sewing dresses for a sister's wedding. They came because their country was being destroyed, and because by 1942 there was almost no family left in the Western Soviet Union that had not lost someone. They came because nobody else could be spared. They came because they believed they were defending not just a government, not just a regime, but the soil their grandmothers were buried in, the rivers their mothers had taught them to swim in, the small, ordinary lives they had assumed would continue. The second thing you have to understand is what was waiting for them on the other side of the line. In March of 1941, 3 months before the German invasion of the Soviet Union began, the German army issued a set of internal directives that have come down to historians as the criminal orders. The most famous of these was the Commissar Order, which instructed Wehrmacht units to execute captured Soviet political officers without trial. But there were others, less well known, that mattered even more to women. One specific directive, issued through the channels of the German Army's Quartermaster General, made clear that female personnel of the Red Army were not to be considered prisoners of war within the meaning of the 1929 Geneva Convention. The legal pretext, such as it was, rested on the fact that the Soviet Union had not ratified the relevant articles of the convention. The practical meaning of the directive was that captured Soviet women in uniform were placed entirely outside the protection of international law. They were also placed inside something else. Nazi propaganda had a word for them: Flintenweiber, rifle women, and the word was not neutral. It was the same word the German press had used during the First World War to describe French civilians who allegedly shot at German soldiers from windows. It carried the implication that any woman who took up arms had forfeited her status as a woman, as a civilian, as a human being entitled to the ordinary mercies. SS publications described Soviet female soldiers as the natural product of what they called Bolshevism's degradation of the family, not as soldiers, as something monstrous. This was not idle rhetoric. It became operational doctrine. In a memo circulated to Einsatzgruppen commanders in the summer of 1941, a memo declassified only in 1989, the term special treatment appears in connection with captured female combatants. The phrase was a euphemism. It meant what it usually meant in German military bureaucracy of that era. It meant they were not to come back. There is one further fact, and it complicates everything that comes next. On the Soviet side, on the 16th of August in 1941, Joseph Stalin signed Order Number 270. Its text was read aloud to every Red Army unit in the field. It declared that any Soviet soldier who allowed themselves to be captured was a traitor to the motherland. Their families would lose their ration cards. Their children would be marked. Their wives would, in some cases, be arrested. The order made no distinction between men and women, between those who surrendered and those who were taken unconscious off the battlefield. This meant that for Nadia Kuznetsova, kneeling in the snow outside Vyazma with her hands red to the wrists, watching a German motorcycle skid to a stop 15 meters away, the moment of capture was not the beginning of one nightmare. It was the beginning of two. Behind her was a country that, by official decree, no longer recognized her as one of its own. Ahead of her was an army that had been formally instructed not to recognize her as a human being at all. She did not know any of this. Almost none of the women did. They had been told their country would protect them. They had been told their training would protect them. They had been told that the laws of war, those words written down in Switzerland in 1929 by men in dark suits, would protect them. None of it would. The forest at Vyazma was one of the great catastrophes of the war. In a pocket about 130 kilometers west of Moscow, 4 Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed in the first 3 weeks of October 1941. The official German figures, issued by their own propaganda ministry, claimed 670,000 Soviet prisoners taken. Soviet historians, working decades later from incomplete records, put the real number somewhat lower, but still in the hundreds of thousands. Among them, in numbers that no one bothered to count, were women. Nadia was loaded onto a truck the same afternoon. The truck had been used to haul horses. The floor was still covered in straw, and the straw was wet, and the smell of it stayed with her for the rest of her life. There were perhaps 30 people in the truck bed, packed standing because there was no room to sit. She recognized none of them. A young soldier beside her, no older than 17, kept reaching up to touch his head where his cap had been before the Germans took it. He did this every few seconds, as if checking that something was still there. By nightfall, he had stopped speaking. By morning, he had stopped breathing. The Germans did not stop the truck. They drove for 2 days. There was no food. There was no water except snow scraped off the truck's tarpaulin with a tin cup that was passed hand to hand. Twice the truck stopped and the dead were thrown out. The first time, Nadia helped lift them. The second time, she did not have the strength. She was separated from the men at a place called Roslavl. There had been a Soviet army barracks there once. It was now a transit camp, surrounded by triple barbed wire and watchtowers built so recently, the wood was still pale and fresh, the sap still bright at the cut ends. As the prisoners were unloaded, a German Feldwebel walked along the line and pulled out anyone whose hair was long enough to suggest she was a woman. Some had cut their hair short to pass. The Feldwebel checked these by other means. Nadia was directed to a small wooden building at the far end of the compound. Inside, 14 other women already sat against the walls. Most of them were soldiers like her. 2 were medics in identifiable uniforms. One was very young, perhaps 15, in civilian clothes, and weeping silently with her face turned toward the wall. None of the guards spoke to them for the first night. This silence, in retrospect, was the most frightening part. The women understood, without being told, that whatever was coming had not yet been decided. It was being decided somewhere else. 800 kilometers to the south, in a different sector and a different month, Yelena Petrova was captured under different circumstances. She was a radio operator, 24 years old. From the city of Kharkov, where her father had taught mathematics at the Polytechnic, and her mother had given piano lessons in the front room of a small apartment near the river. In August of 1942, she had been parachuted behind German lines to coordinate with a partisan unit operating in the forests near Bryansk. The drop had gone wrong. Her parachute had caught in a tree, and she had hung there for nearly an hour in the dark before she could cut herself down with the small knife in her boot. By the time she reached the rendezvous point in the morning, the partisans were dead. All of them. Someone had betrayed them. She was discovered 3 days later, sheltering in the cellar of a farmhouse where an elderly couple had given her bread and milk and a place to sleep, by a German patrol that had been specifically tracking her radio signal. She wore, around her neck under her tunic, a small wooden icon of St. Nicholas that her grandmother had pressed into her hand the day she left for Moscow. The Wehrmacht corporal who searched her found it and looked at it for a long time. He did not return it. He did not break it either. He simply put it in his own pocket and continued the search. She did not ask for it back. There would have been no point. She was taken first to a regional Gestapo office in Bryansk for interrogation. The interrogation lasted 11 days. Of those 11 days, she would, decades later, describe almost nothing. She would say only this, that on the morning of the 8th day, an interpreter was brought in to translate. A Russian-speaking woman, a Volksdeutsche from Odessa, perhaps 40 years old, with a kind face and an old wedding ring. When she sat down across from Yelena, the woman leaned forward and whispered, in Russian, 2 words, "Forgive me." Then she translated the questions, and she translated them faithfully, and she did not look at Yelena's face when she was finished. The elderly couple who had sheltered her in the farmhouse were both shot the same day Yelena was taken. The farmhouse was burned. This Yelena learned only later, from another prisoner, in another place, in another year. A third woman entered this story in November of 1942 in the rubble of Stalingrad. Her name was Vera Sokolova. She was 19 years old. She had trained as a sniper at the Central Women's Sniper Training School in the suburbs of Moscow, where roughly 2,000 women would be trained over the course of the war, and where instructors taught that the breath had to be released exactly halfway before the trigger was pulled. Vera had a small black notebook that she carried in the inner pocket of her tunic. In the notebook, in her own careful schoolgirl handwriting, she kept a tally of every confirmed engagement. The numbers were not large. She had been at the front for only 7 weeks, but they were honest numbers, written down in pencil that had been sharpened with a knife. The building she was operating from collapsed during a German artillery barrage on the 11th of November. When she regained consciousness, her left arm was broken in 2 places, her rifle was buried somewhere in the masonry, and a German infantryman was standing over her with a submachine gun. He looked, she would remember, very young. Perhaps her own age. He looked, more than anything, tired. He shouted something she did not understand. Then he kicked the small notebook out of her tunic where it had fallen open in the dust, picked it up, looked at the columns of figures, and his face changed. It changed in a particular way she would think about for the rest of her life. It did not become angry. It became something quieter than anger, something that recognized what she was and knew what was supposed to be done with her and was already calculating distances and trucks and the time of day. She was put in a cellar with 7 other women that night. By morning, there were 5. It would be wrong, and it would be too simple to suggest that what was done to captured Soviet women was the same everywhere, by every German unit, in every month of the war. It was not the same. There were Wehrmacht commanders who quietly disregarded the directive about female combatants. There were prison camp commandants who treated captured medics as POWs and put them to work in camp hospitals. There were guards who looked the other way, and translators who passed extra bread, and doctors who treated wounds they had been told to leave untreated. The variation is part of the historical record. Sometimes it depended on the unit. sometimes on the front, sometimes on a single officer's conscience or lack of it. But the directive existed, and where it was followed, what followed was very bad indeed. For some of the women taken at Vyazma and at Bryansk and in the rubble of Stalingrad, the journey ended within hours. They were taken behind a wall, or to a ravine, or to the edge of a wood, and what happened there was recorded, when it was recorded at all, in the unit war diaries of the Einsatzgruppen and their attached police battalions, in language so dry it took historians decades to understand what they were reading. The phrase that appears again and again is treated according to orders. Sometimes the figures are given, 47, 112, 230. Sometimes the women are not even counted separately from the men. There are photographs. The German army did not, at first, forbid its soldiers from taking photographs of executions, and many of them did. These photographs, recovered after the war from albums and footlockers and the wallets of dead Wehrmacht men, sit now in the archives of several European nations. They are not difficult to find if you know where to look. What they show is, in most cases, a small group of women standing at the edge of a pit, or beneath a tree, or against a wooden fence. In some of them, the women are still wearing their red army tunics. In some, they are not. Their faces, in almost every case, are calm. The historians who have studied these photographs have written about that calm, about what it took to achieve it in those last moments. They have not been able to explain it exactly. They have only described it. This is one thing that happened. There were others. A second path led west, to the camps, to Soldau in East Prussia, and to Majdanek near Lublin, and eventually, for many of the surviving Soviet women in uniform, to a place in the marshlands north of Berlin called Ravensbrück. Ravensbrück was the only Nazi concentration camp built specifically for women. It had been established in 1939 near the village of Fürstenberg, on the shore of a small lake whose water was, in summer, dark and full of reeds. Over the course of the war, more than 130,000 women would be sent there from more than 30 countries. The majority of them did not return. The exact death toll has never been settled. The camp's own records were destroyed in the final weeks before liberation. The estimates run between 30,000 and 90,000. The truth, like the truth of so much else in this story, lies inside that gap and has been waiting there a long time. Nadia and Yelena both arrived at Ravensbrück in the winter of 1942 to 1943 in separate transports, and they did not know each other yet. The first thing that happened to them, and to every woman who came through the gate, was a procedure that the camp's own administrative regulations described, in clinical German, as Aufnahme, admission. They were taken to a low building near the entrance. They were ordered to undress completely. Their clothes were taken from them and placed in numbered piles to be sent to a sorting facility where civilian women, prisoners themselves, would search the seams for hidden valuables. Their personal effects were confiscated. The small things, the things they had hidden for over a year, a photograph in a boot, an icon in a tunic lining, a child's first tooth in a folded paper, a husband's wedding ring strung on a piece of thread, were taken and entered into a ledger and never seen again. Then their hair was cut. This took place in a separate room. The clippers were not always sharp. The women were not always allowed to keep their heads still. For most of them, for the village girls from Belarus and the factory workers from Tula and the school teachers from Kharkov, this was the moment when something inside them, something they had carried unbroken through the truck and the train and the cold, finally broke. The hair was swept into sacks. The sacks were sent to a German factory in Bremen, where the hair was processed into industrial felt. This was the official documented use of the hair of women in Nazi camps. It is in the records. Yelena, who had grown her hair long enough to sit on, knelt on the floor while it was cut. She did not cry. She did not speak. She remembered, instead, a single line from a poem her grandmother had recited when she was very small. She would not be able to remember the rest of the poem for 50 years. Only the one line, about how the seasons turn and how a thing that is taken in winter can be returned in spring. Nothing she lost that day was returned to her. They were given a striped dress, wooden clogs that did not fit, a triangle of cloth sewn to the chest in a color that designated their category, red for political prisoners, which is what Soviet servicewomen were classified as, and a number. The number replaced the name. From that day forward, on the parade ground at dawn, when the guards counted them, the women answered to numbers. This was the structure of the place. Now I want to tell you what happened inside it. The daily routine at Ravensbrück was governed by a bell and by a whistle. The bell rang at 4 in the morning. The whistle followed it, sharp and short, and any woman who did not stand at the foot of her bunk within 60 seconds was beaten. The beatings were administered by women. This is one of the harder facts of the camp's history. The female SS overseers, the Aufseherinnen, were civilian women trained at a special school on the camp's own grounds. There were several hundred of them by 1944. Some had been factory workers before the war. Some had been hairdressers, sales clerks, the wives of unemployed men. They had been recruited with promises of decent wages and uniforms, and they had been trained, methodically, to do what they did. One of them, in Nadia's block, was named in the survivor testimonies only as Strauss. She was perhaps 30 years old, blonde, with pale eyebrows and a habit of cleaning her fingernails with a small wooden stick while she watched the morning count. She did not beat the women herself often. She had a younger Aufseherin who did that for her. What Strauss did, instead, was decide. She decided who would be sent to the Siemens factory and who would be sent to the road brigades. She decided who would receive the extra ladle of soup and who would receive nothing. She decided in the spring of 1943 that the Polish prisoner in the next bunk to Nadia, a girl named Hannah, who had been a schoolteacher in Krakow, had been speaking insolently. Hannah was taken away that afternoon and did not return. The work was the second axis of the camp. The women were assigned to one of several labor brigades. Some worked in the Siemens electrical components factory that had been built on the camp's southern edge, assembling small relays and switches by hand for 10 or 11 hours a day. The pay, recorded in the company's accounting books and recovered after the war, was paid to the SS, not to the women. Some worked in the camp's own workshops, sewing uniforms for the German army. Some worked on the road brigades, breaking stones in the marshes, or in the forestry detail, dragging timber out of the woods around the lake. Nadia, because of her medical training, was assigned to the camp infirmary. This was both a mercy and a kind of curse. The infirmary at Ravensbrück was not, in any meaningful sense, a hospital. It had perhaps 60 beds for tens of thousands of women. There were almost no medicines. There were no proper instruments. What it had, instead, was a German doctor named Oberheiser and a small staff of SS physicians and a wing at the back of the building that the prisoners learned not to talk about. In that wing, beginning in 1942, a series of medical experiments were performed on a group of Polish women prisoners who became known within the camp as the króliki, the rabbits. The experiments involved deliberate wounding of the women's legs and the introduction of certain substances into the wounds and the observation of what followed. The stated purpose was to study battlefield infections in support of the German war effort. The actual results were what one would expect them to be. Of the 74 women subjected to the procedures, the names of all of whom are now known, many died. Those who survived spent the rest of their lives unable to walk without pain. Nadia was not permitted into that wing. She knew what happened there only from the sounds, and from the women who came out, and from one Polish nurse, a fellow prisoner, an older woman named Wanda who had been a midwife in Warsaw, who told her, in whispers, after lights out, what she had seen. It was Wanda who taught Nadia how to survive in the infirmary. Wanda who showed her which patients to mark as fit for work even when they were not, because the alternative was the selection lists. Wanda who taught her to keep a small piece of bread in her sleeve for the very weakest, and to share it without being seen. Wanda who, on a single night in November of 1943, took Nadia by both wrists and said, in a voice so quiet it was barely a voice, that the most important thing in the camp was not to live. The most important thing was to remain inside herself, the person who had walked through the gate. "Do not let them make you their kind of person," Wanda said. "That is the worst thing they can do. The rest is only pain." Yelena, who had been assigned to the Siemens factory, did not have a Wanda. She had instead the other women on her shift. They were Russian, Polish, French, Dutch, Yugoslav, German. They did not all share a language. What they shared was the long table of metal components and the wooden boxes into which the finished pieces were sorted, and the silent understanding that to slow down was dangerous and to speed up was worse. They worked out a system, a small piece of bread, broken off and passed under the table to the woman who had not received her morning ration. A whispered Russian word, or French, or Polish, that meant the overseer was watching and you should keep your eyes down. A song, hummed under the breath in fragments, that no one was sure anyone else recognized, but that became, over months, the song of that particular shift. Yelena, who had grown up with her mother's piano, hummed a few bars of a Tchaikovsky melody one morning in the spring of 1944. By that evening, a French girl at the other end of the table was humming it back to her. They never spoke. They never sat at the same table at meals. But for the next year, until everything fell apart, they hummed that small piece of music to each other across the long room, and it was, in its way, a kind of conversation. There were other small things, a prayer murmured in Belarusian by a peasant woman in the next bunk, the same prayer every night, the same words, until the words themselves became a comfort and a kind of clock. A New Year's celebration in January of 1944, in the back of a block, conducted in absolute silence by a Russian woman who had taught singing at a music school in Leningrad before the siege, and who that night, with no music and no candles, conducted 10 other women in a wordless mass that lasted perhaps 4 minutes. A pair of stockings, knitted in secret from threads pulled out of the lining of a blanket, presented to a young French girl on the morning of her 19th birthday by the women of her block, who had pooled scraps for weeks. It is important to record these things, because the camp was not only what was done to the women. The camp was also what the women did, with the very little they had left. There were nights in the long winter of 1943 when a small group of women in Nadia's block would gather around the bunk of a Russian schoolteacher named Clara, who had been at the camp longer than any of them. Clara had memorized, before her arrest in 1941, large portions of Pushkin. She would recite, in a whisper that did not carry past the edge of the bunk, whole passages of Yevgeny Onegin. The other women would lie still and listen. Some of them did not speak Russian well enough to follow the words. They listened anyway. They listened, they would later say, for the sound of a human voice making something that was not an order, for the cadence of poetry, which is a different cadence from anything a guard ever uses, for the simple fact that Clara remembered. That memory itself, in that place, was a kind of defiance. Clara died in the spring of 1944. The women in the block continued to recite the passages she had taught them. By the end of the war, 6 women in that block could recite, from memory, the entire first canto of the poem. They had not known each other before the camp. Some of them had not been on speaking terms with each other inside the camp because of arguments over bread or sleeping space, or some small offense that mattered more than it should have in that closed world. but they had all learned Clara's passages, and they all knew, without ever saying so, that they were keeping her alive in the only way that was still possible. Sometimes history is shaped not by what happens, but by what does not. In the German records of the period, in the careful columns of figures that the Aufseherinnen submitted to their supervisors every week, there is no entry for a hummed Tchaikovsky melody. There is no column for a prayer in Belarusian. There is no line item for the bread broken in half under the table. These things were not in the bureaucracy. They were what the bureaucracy could not see, but they were what kept the women alive. Not all of them, not most of them, but enough of them that when the end came, there were still living women in Ravensbrück who could remember, and remembering, as it turned out, was the thing that mattered most. Vera Sokolova was not at Ravensbrück. After her capture in Stalingrad in November of 1942, she was taken first to a transit camp at Dnipropetrovsk, and from there, in February of 1943, to a smaller camp in eastern Poland, whose name does not appear in most of the major histories of the war. She was 19 years old when she arrived there. She was 20 years old when she died there. The cause of her death, as recorded in the camp's surviving administrative ledger, was typhus. The actual cause was a winter in clothes inadequate to the weather and a daily ration of soup that contained, by laboratory analysis performed by Allied investigators in 1945, fewer than 500 calories. Before she died, she found a way to give the small black notebook, the one with her schoolgirl handwriting and the careful columns of figures from Stalingrad, to another Soviet woman in the camp who hid it inside a hollowed-out heel of a wooden clog. That woman survived. The notebook survived. It is now in a museum in Volgograd, the city that used to be called Stalingrad, in a glass case near the back of the second floor, and the figures in it are still legible. The pencil has not faded. There is one other thing about Vera that should be recorded, because it was recorded by the woman who carried the notebook home, and because the woman in question said it at length, late in her life, in the recording that is now in the museum's archive. In the last weeks before Vera died, she had been trying to write a letter to her mother. She had no paper. She had no pencil except the stub she used for the notebook, and that pencil was, by then, almost gone. So she wrote the letter in fragments, on small scraps torn from a German cement bag that had been left in the corner of the barrack, using a piece of charcoal scraped from the stove. She wrote a few words at a time, over many nights, in the cold light that came through the slats of the boarded window. She did not finish the letter. The fragments were folded together and tucked inside the notebook by the woman who hid the clog, and they, too, survive. The handwriting on the fragments is no longer schoolgirl handwriting. It is the handwriting of someone whose hand was shaking. The fragments do not, when laid together in their proper order, form a coherent message. They form instead a series of small phrases. The phrase, "Mama, do not be afraid for me," appears 3 times in slightly different forms. The phrase, "The apple tree by the gate," appears twice. The phrase, "If you can, please," appears once, with nothing after it. This is one of the small ways the dead, in this war, sometimes manage to speak. The war on the Eastern Front turned in 1943, and by the summer of 1944, the Red Army was driving the Wehrmacht westward at a speed that surprised even the Soviet High Command. By January of 1945, Soviet forces had crossed the Vistula. By February, they were on the Oder. By April, they were in the suburbs of Berlin. For the camps, this meant the order to evacuate. The order came down in different forms to different camps. At some places, it meant marching the surviving prisoners westward, away from the advancing Soviet front, in long columns through the snow. At others, it meant the destruction of records, the burning of buildings, and the abandonment of the dying. At Ravensbrück, in the final weeks of April 1945, it meant both. Nadia and Yelena, who by then had been at the camp for more than 2 years, were among the thousands of women ordered out onto the road in the last days of the war. They had still not met each other. They had each been so thinned out by hunger and by labor that their own mothers would not have recognized them. Nadia weighed perhaps 41 kilograms. Yelena, who had always been smaller, weighed less. The columns moved north and west, away from the Soviet advance, in the rain that came down without stopping for the better part of 2 weeks. There was no food. There were no rations issued. The guards, many of whom understood by then that the war was lost, behaved in different ways. Some shot the stragglers without hesitation. Some, especially the older guards, simply let them fall behind and did not look back. Some abandoned the columns altogether and disappeared into the German forests in their stolen civilian clothes. The women died on the road in numbers that have never been precisely counted. The bodies were left in the ditches or in the woods or beside small German villages whose inhabitants, in many cases, did not even come out to look. Sometimes a local farmer would leave a bucket of water at the edge of the road in the night. Sometimes a child would slip a piece of bread to a woman in the line. Sometimes nothing at all. The journey took, for most of the columns, between 8 and 14 days. On the 4th day, Nadia's column passed through a small German town whose name she would never afterward be able to remember. It was a market day. The shops were open. The women in the line could see, through the open windows of a bakery, loaves of dark bread stacked on a wooden shelf. The smell of the bread reached the road. One woman in the line, a Hungarian Jew who had been at Ravensbrück for 9 months, began to laugh. She laughed for perhaps 2 minutes, quietly, in a way that did not sound like laughter at all, and then she stopped. The column moved on. No one in the town said anything. No one came out. The shutters of the upper floor windows began, one by one, to close as the column passed. On the 7th day, the woman walking on Nadia's right, a Belgian resistance fighter, perhaps 35 years old, who had been arrested in Antwerp in 1943, sat down at the edge of the road and could not be made to get up again. The guard at the rear of the column came forward. Nadia did not look. She heard what she heard. The column continued. For the rest of the day, the woman walking on Nadia's left, a Russian peasant woman from somewhere near Smolensk, whose name Nadia never learned, sang under her breath, very quietly, an old folk song that Nadia had heard her grandmother sing in childhood. The peasant woman did not sing well. She got some of the words wrong. She kept singing. Yelena collapsed on the 11th day. She was lifted by 2 women on either side of her, and carried for the rest of that day and into the next. On the morning of the 13th day, the column was overtaken by a Red Army cavalry reconnaissance unit on the outskirts of a small German town. The guards fled. The Soviet officer in charge of the unit, a young captain perhaps 26 years old, dismounted from his horse and walked along the column without saying anything for a long time. Then he turned to his men and gave a series of quiet orders. Within an hour, there were blankets. Within 2 hours, there was a wagon, requisitioned from a German farmhouse, on which the weakest women were laid. Within 4 hours, there was soup, weak and thin but warm, made from potatoes that had been taken from the same farm. The young captain, before he rode on, walked back along the line of women lying on the grass and stopped in front of Yelena, who was conscious by then, and watching him with eyes that had become enormous in her thin face. He took off his own coat, which was the heavy gray wool coat of a Soviet cavalry officer, and laid it over her. He did not say anything. He did not need to. Then he mounted his horse, and his unit rode west, and Yelena never saw him again, and she also never forgot him. This should be where the story ends. It is not where the story ends. In May of 1945, in the weeks immediately following the German surrender, Soviet liberated prisoners, including eventually both Nadia and Yelena, were assembled into transit camps inside the territory of the new Soviet zone of occupation. From these camps, they were processed. The processing was conducted by the counterintelligence organization known as SMERSH, an acronym for the Russian phrase Smert Shpionam, death to spies. The screening was thorough. Every returning prisoner was interrogated, sometimes for many hours over many days, about the circumstances of their capture, the names of fellow prisoners, the conduct of the German guards, and, most pointedly, whether they had collaborated in any way during their captivity. Stalin's Order No. 270, the one signed in the dark August of 1941, had not been rescinded. Its logic, that a Soviet soldier who had been captured was a traitor by definition, remained in effect. For some of the returning women, the screening resulted in clearance and a ticket home. For others, many others, it resulted in transfer to camps that had a different name, in a different language, run by their own government. The system was called the Gulag. The sentences, in the records that have since been opened, ran from 5 years to 25. Yelena Petrova was given 8 years. The charge, as it appears in her file, was that during her interrogation in Bryansk in August of 1942, she had given the Germans information that led to the deaths of 2 members of the partisan unit she had been sent to coordinate with. The fact that the partisan unit had already been dead when she arrived at the rendezvous point did not appear in the file. The fact that the 11 days of interrogation had taken place in a Gestapo cell did not appear in the file. The fact that she had survived 2.5 years in Ravensbrück by humming Tchaikovsky to a French girl across a factory table did not appear in the file. She served 7 of the 8 years in a labor camp in northern Kazakhstan, building a railway through ground that was frozen for 9 months out of the year. She was released on a partial amnesty in 1953, in the weeks following Stalin's death. She returned to Kharkov to find that her parents' apartment had been destroyed in the German occupation, that her parents had died, her father of typhus, her mother of grief, and that the building where her mother had given piano lessons in the front room was now a state-owned shoe repair shop. She found work as a translator at a technical institute. She married a man who had also returned from the camps, who had served 11 years for an offense even less defensible than hers, and who never spoke of it. They had no children. They lived very quietly. She kept on her bedroom wall for the rest of her life a small framed icon of St. Nicholas that she had purchased from a market in Tashkent in 1954, because the original, the one her grandmother had pressed into her hand, had been taken from her by a Wehrmacht corporal in a farmhouse cellar in the autumn of 1942, and she had wanted for the rest of her life something to put in its place. Nadia was, by the standards of the time, luckier. She was cleared by SMERSH after 11 days of interrogation. She was given travel papers and a thin ration card and a one-way ticket to Smolensk. She arrived there in July of 1945 to find that her mother had died of pneumonia in the winter of 1942, that her brother had been killed at Kursk in July of 1943, that the apartment building she had grown up in had been hit by a German bomb in 1941 and never rebuilt, and that of the people she had known before the war, the friends from medical school, the neighbors from her childhood courtyard, the boy who had taught her to ride a bicycle at the age of 7, perhaps 1 in 5 was still alive and still in the city. She found a room in a communal apartment. She found work as a nurse at a small district clinic. She married, in 1949, a quiet man who had lost a leg at Stalingrad and who never asked her where she had been during the war. She had 2 children, a boy in 1951 and a girl in 1954. She raised them carefully, sent them to school in clean clothes, helped them with their homework at the kitchen table in the long Smolensk evenings. She did not speak, to them or to anyone else, of Vyazma or of Roslavl, or of the journey west or of Ravensbrück. She did not speak of it for 40 years. The archives began to open in the early 1990s. In Russia, the long silence around Soviet prisoners of war, the silence enforced by Order 270, and by the gulag sentences, and by the simple shame of having been on the wrong side of the wire, began, finally, to lift. In Germany, declassified Wehrmacht and SS documents from the Federal Archives in Koblenz and the military archives in Freiburg began to make their way into the hands of historians. The directives that had been issued in March of 1941, the Einsatzgruppen reports with their cold euphemisms, the administrative records of Ravensbrück that had survived the destruction of the final weeks, the photographs that had been taken by German soldiers and sent home to their families, and then, decades later, found in attics by their grandchildren and turned over, with varying degrees of reluctance, to historians and museums. A Belarusian researcher named Larisa Antonova, working out of a small institute in Minsk, began in 1993 to interview surviving Soviet women who had been captured during the war. She found, in the end, more than 400 of them, scattered across the territory of the former Soviet Union. Most were in their 70s or 80s. Most had never been asked in any formal way to tell their stories. Most were not sure at first that they wanted to. The interviews followed a pattern that Antonova later wrote about, in a short methodological essay that almost no one outside her field has read. The women would begin, in almost every case, by apologizing. They would apologize for not remembering more. They would apologize for not having been more useful to the war effort. They would apologize for not having done more for the dead. They would apologize, several of them, for being alive. Antonova learned, after the first dozen interviews, to wait through these apologies in silence, not to argue with them, not to try to reassure the women, just to wait. Because what came after the apology, in almost every case, was the story. The stories themselves were not, on the whole, dramatic in the way that wartime stories are usually dramatic. The women did not raise their voices. They did not weep, mostly. They spoke in the flat, plain register of people who had decided, many decades earlier, that the only way to survive what they had survived was to describe it the way one would describe a long illness or a long journey. They mentioned the cold. They mentioned the hunger. They mentioned, again and again, particular kindnesses, a piece of bread, a whispered word, a hand laid briefly on a shoulder in the dark. They mentioned the names of the women who had died. They mentioned, with great precision, the names of the women who had died, because the names of the dead were the one thing they had carried out, and the one thing they could now give back. It was Larisa Antonova who found Nadia in the spring of 1996, in the same small apartment in Smolensk, where Nadia had been living since 1953. Nadia was 77 years old. She was a widow by then. Her son had moved to St. Petersburg, her daughter to Kiev. She had told no one her full story, not even her husband while he was alive. She told it to Larisa Antonova over the course of 7 afternoons, in March and April of 1996, with a small tape recorder running on the kitchen table between them. When she had finished, she said, "I never thought anyone would want to know." That was the central tragedy. Not only what had been done to them, but the long second silence afterward, the silence imposed by their own country, the silence that had made many of them feel that what they had survived had not been considered worth surviving. In the spring of 2003, a small exhibit opened at a museum in Minsk, in a single ground-floor room, devoted to the Soviet women who had been captured during the war. There were perhaps 40 photographs. There were perhaps 120 documents in translation. There was a small glass case containing a wooden clog with a hollowed-out heel, and inside the heel, a small black notebook in a schoolgirl's careful pencil. There was Yelena Petrova's icon of St. Nicholas, the replacement one, donated to the museum after her death in 1998. At the opening, an old woman of 91 was invited to speak. She had been a sniper trainee in 1942, captured at Stalingrad with Vera Sokolova, and she had survived the same small camp in eastern Poland in which Vera had died. She was the one who had hollowed out the wooden clog. She was the one who had carried the notebook home. She stood at a small podium in front of perhaps 60 people. She did not have notes. She spoke for about 4 minutes. She said this, or words very close to these, in the Russian in which she said them, which the museum recorded. She said that she had spent her whole adult life trying to understand what had happened to them. She had read the books. She had read the documents. She had spoken, when she was younger, to other survivors. And in the end, she said, she had come to believe 2 things. The first was that the greatest danger in any war is not the violence of the enemy. The greatest danger is the moment when one side, any side, decides that the other side is not human. That moment, she said, was the moment everything else became possible. Without that moment, none of it could have happened. With it, all of it became inevitable. The second thing she had come to believe was harder to say. She said it slowly. She said that the second greatest danger in any war is the comfortable certainty that one's own country will protect one if one suffers enough for it. She said that she had once believed this, very deeply, as a girl of 19. She said that she did not believe it any longer. She said that her country had not protected her, and had not protected her friends, and had asked them, when they came home, to apologize for having been captured. She said that this had been almost harder, in its own quiet way, than what had been done to them by the other side. Because the other side, she said, had at least been honest about what it thought of them. Her own side had told them they were heroes, and then treated them as something else. She stopped speaking then. The room was very quiet. Someone in the front row began to applaud, and then stopped, because applause did not seem to be the right response. She stood at the podium for a few more seconds, and then she stepped down, and a young woman from the museum walked her back to her seat. She died the following winter, in February of 2004, at the age of 92. The recording of her speech is in the museum's archive in Minsk. It is, as far as anyone knows, the longest single statement any captured Soviet woman ever made publicly about what had happened to her and to the others. Her name, for the record, was Sofia Markovna Yermolova. She had been born in a village outside Pskov in 1912. She had been a schoolteacher before the war. She had taught reading to children for 16 years before she was sent to the sniper school. After her release from the labor camp in 1953, she had returned to teaching in a different village, in a different region, and had taught reading to children for 31 more years before her retirement. The children she taught after the war did not know what their teacher had survived. The first of them learned only at her funeral, when a man from the museum in Minsk read the eulogy and named the places and the years. There is one more thing. In 2007, a small monument was unveiled in a park on the outskirts of Smolensk, dedicated to the Soviet women who had been taken prisoner during the Great Patriotic War. The monument is not large. It is a granite block, about waist high, with a single line carved into it in Russian. The line was chosen by the families of the survivors and by the historians who had worked with them. It reads, in translation, "They were not forgotten by us. We were too late, but we did not forget." Nadia Kuznetsova was at the unveiling. She was 88 years old. She was photographed by a journalist from a local paper, standing next to the monument with her hand resting on the top of the granite. She was wearing a dark coat. Her hair was white and very thin. Her hand was visible on the stone. She died the following year, in the autumn of 2008, in the same small apartment in Smolensk. Her daughter, who had come from Kiev to be with her at the end, sat with her through the final night. In the morning, going through her mother's small bookshelf, she found, inside an old medical textbook from the 1940s, a photograph that she had never seen before. A photograph of a young man in a Red Army uniform, smiling, taken in the summer of 1940. On the back, in pencil, in handwriting that had not changed in 70 years, was a single line: "For the day I am asked." She had been waiting perhaps all of those years for someone to ask. By the time they finally did, almost everyone she would have wanted to tell was already gone. What was done to the captured women of the Red Army was not the worst thing that happened in the Second World War. There is no contest to be won here, and to claim one would be obscene. But it was, for a very long time, one of the most carefully forgotten things. It was forgotten because the perpetrators were ashamed, because the country that should have honored the survivors was instead suspicious of them, because the world that emerged from the war preferred its stories simpler than this one would let itself be. The women themselves, the ones who came back, did the only thing they could do. They kept their photographs in old textbooks. They kept their icons on bedroom walls. They kept the small notebooks of their dead friends in glass cases in distant museums. They waited, in their long, ordinary lives, for someone to ask. When someone finally did, they spoke. Quietly, carefully, without exaggeration, without bitterness, as though they had been rehearsing, for half a century, the words they would use when the silence was finally allowed to break. Their words are the record now. Their words and the documents that survived and the photographs that should not exist but do. Maybe history's most dangerous lie is the one that tells us our enemies are not human. The second most dangerous is the one that tells us our own side will always protect us if we suffer enough for it. Both of these lies were told, in this war, to millions of young women in green tunics with red crosses on their sleeves. Both lies were paid for in full by the women who believed them. Their names are now being written down, one by one, in the archives that have finally opened. Their stories are being recorded, one by one, in the testimonies that no one wanted to hear when there was still time to hear them, and that we are listening to now because there is no longer any choice. It is late, but it is not nothing. If you found this story worth remembering, please consider subscribing so the others, and there are many others, on every side of every war, are not lost in the same silence. Like the video to help it reach more people who care about this kind of history, and share it with anyone you know who still believes that the past is a settled thing. And in the comments below, tell me one part of this story that challenged something you thought you knew about the Second World War. I read what you write. I think about it. And the next video, like this one, is shaped by what you tell me you want to remember. Until then, take care of each other. The way, in the end, those women took care of each other. Because that, in any war, is the only thing that turned out to be worth anything at all.